Hey, U.S. history. So today we are going to talk about what happened right after the stock market crashed and the Great Depression started. And we are particularly going to talk about Herbert Hoover and how he took the blame for everything, and was it really his fault? All right. So, the jobless stood on city street corners hoping to sell apples for 5 cents. The homeless rode the rails from fright yard to fright yard, often camping in hobo jungles. Okies left their dust-choked farms on the Great Plains looking for work. Poor teachers in Chicago prepared meals to feed their hungry students. This was the Great Depression. The nation that had come to be one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the world was somehow thrown into this confusing economic crisis, and nobody quite knew why or how to get out of it. Although most Americans did escape severe deprivation, not that the pictures will show you that. Few of them passed through the 1930s without some element of hardship or anxiety. Franklin Roosevelt, during his 1932 campaign, described the despondency and said, "I've looked into the faces of thousands, and they have the frightened looks of lost children." This was the Great Depression. So during 1928, let's go back a little bit. In the 1928 election campaign, Herbert Hoover had promised the nation a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Now, the Republicans are gladly accepting credit for the prosperity of the 1920s, right? The 1920s were a great time, the roaring 20s, until that day in 1929. Hoover really expected to be able, Americans voted for Hoover in 1928 because they expected him to be able to keep this existence going. And then when the stock market crashed, they began to blame him, right? Who do you blame? You blame the president. Now, contrary to popular assumptions, American economic prosperity did not evaporate overnight. The stock market didn't crash and then all of a sudden, bam, next day everybody's poor. That's not how that works. The conditions that led to the stock market crash had been developing all throughout the 20s, and then the impact was compounded in the months following. I think hopefully now that we've been having this quarantine, you start to understand how long months can be. For example, we've only been quarantined, we've only been out of school for 7 weeks. And 6 weeks. And so think about something that takes months and months to happen, this times over and over again. The problems of unemployment, poverty, and despair began to surface, but don't become widespread until almost a full year later. Even so, the economic decline is happening, and Herbert Hoover doesn't want to drop morale. He doesn't want to go out and say, we're in this horrible time. And so he doesn't want to say panic. He doesn't want to say crisis. And so he instead chooses to call it by a depression. Because at that point, first of all, the mental illness of depression, the concept of depression doesn't exist. Most people thought of a depression as a slight decline before an incline. Think of a depression in a pillow after you put your head on it. A depression in a mountain. That was what he called it. He called it a depression because depression, in the terms of Americans at the time, wasn't that scary of a thing. It was down and then it was going to go up again. Historians, economists, and politicians endlessly analyze the cause. And though certain factors definitely contributed, there aren't very many easy answers. Like, there's 3 big things that we talked about, or that you read about for yesterday, but there's no easy answers. There's no, this is why. It's evident that the growing debt of consumers eventually resulted in this loss of purchasing power. The loss then decreases demand, which causes businesses to slow production, which means that they have to lay off workers. The increase in unemployment leads to further decline in purchasing power, leads to further cutbacks. So it's a cycle. It's a downward spiral as things get worse. But what causes the economy to pretty much stop? Some people fault America's big businessmen during the 1920s when they allegedly hardly paid anything to their workers. Others condemn the federal government for its support of laissez-faire capitalism and saying, we're not going to touch it, it'll figure itself out. And then obviously it very much did not. Still others, including Hoover, blamed the international economic situation with the incredible economic depression happening in Germany. You think the Great Depression in America was bad? It didn't hold a candle to what's happening in Germany. It was bad. It was very, very bad. But in Germany, it was 10 times worse than that. And so Hoover is blaming these international factors for the American Great Depression. And so this decline in international trade, you've got high tariffs, a lot of people blamed that. Then one more point is the growth of pessimism. People tend to see the situation as even worse than it is. Cynicism. This is really growing in the 1920s. And about being blamed for the Depression, Hoover once commented saying it's a great compliment to the energies and capacities of one man. He's saying it's not possible for one person to have caused all of this. And it's true. A disappointed public, though, laid the responsibility squarely on him. So what was he doing? What was he trying to fix? Okay, so on October 25th, 1929, the day after the stock market crash, Hoover declared and said, all right, we are sound, we are still prosperous, it's going to be okay. He wanted to restore American confidence. But it's soon Black Thursday, soon followed by Black Tuesday, and then the nation goes into a downward economic spiral. Nonetheless, he's still trying to say, it's okay, it's okay. The Depression's going to be over. And he wanted to inspire the same optimism in the rest of the nation. It's often been implied that Hoover made little effort, but this reputation for inaction is not well earned. He was willing to make changes. He wanted to get the government involved where it hadn't been involved before. By the end of 1929, he got Congress to cut taxes by $140 million, and he encouraged an increase on federal spending for public works. Okay, so Hoover's efforts. So, number one, he cuts taxes, so people don't have to pay the government nearly as much. And two, he encourages this increase in federal spending on public works. Things that will help everybody. Okay, so this is government finance construction of public facilities. He wants to create jobs. They're not small steps, they're big steps, but they didn't provide substantial immediate results that people were looking for. Early in 1932, he pushed Congress to pass the Revenue Act, which actually revives taxes and imposes another tax on gasoline, tires, cars, electricity, and other taxes. It taxes stock transfers and phone messages. It raised the income tax, but he wants to try and get more money for the government so the government can then pour back more money back into the people, but it's not working because the people have no money to give him. So at a time when he probably should have been cutting taxes, he's actually raising them. And then he's also trying to create this major campaign for voluntary cooperation. In December of 1929, the president calls a meeting of 400 business executives. He urges them to voluntarily keep their workers, maintain satisfactory wage levels. So he says, pay them more. He also asks that they continue to invest in new construction equipment. He wants them to keep growing. He wants them to keep spending money on things. The issue is, if the companies did that, most of them would go bankrupt very quickly. And so, unfortunately, they're not. And so they're growing in unemployment, the wages are declining, industrial expansion is ceasing. And even before the stock market crash, Hoover directed Congress to create the Federal Farm Board, which was intended to relieve hardships, but instead, these corporations aren't helping farms at all. Other voluntary efforts, he establishes this emergency committee for employment, which tries to coordinate efforts of the public and private charities, but it's poorly funded, doesn't work. About a year later, the President's Organization for Unemployed Relief still doesn't have the resources to deal with the crisis. Nobody knows how to deal with this many unemployed people. Facing increase for bank failures, Hoover creates the National Credit Corporation, the NCC. And if you think this is a lot of acronyms, wait till we get to FDRs. There's a million. They literally call it alphabet soup. Hoover expects the nation's prosperous banks to help establish this credit reserve fund, but it doesn't work. Nothing works. The only area that he manages to get this voluntary initiative is over government intervention. He sincerely believed that it was the duty of private individuals, not the government, to help people in need. And reluctantly, he is able to give federal money to state governments, but he doesn't want to just start paying people. He wants to have this, instead of the payment, he wants to have this voluntary initiative, mostly by the private companies. So what does the government do? He believed that work relief is what's acceptable. He does not want to dole out a government handout. He wants to believe work relief. He wants to provide people with jobs. He's also determined to keep the federal budget in balance, which is one of the reasons why he's raising taxes, because he doesn't want the government to go into debt or more debt. He establishes the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC. And the RFC is pretty important because it's patterned after the War Finance Corporation, and it receives $500 million to loan out to banks to help people. He also signs in 1930 the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which you might recognize because it really was kind of disastrous and made the economic depression worse. So the Smoot-Hawley Tariff pushed tariffs on foreign industrial and agricultural prices to 40%. The high protectionist tariff intended to help keep things American, but it meant that it shut off foreign trade, it reduced the market for American goods, and it did not help bring recovery. In fact, it probably made things much worse. The increase in the tariff undoubtedly helped to precipitate the economic collapse in Europe in 1931. So Europe's collapsing too. Hoover is very concerned about this because he's believing that if Europe is also depressed, then how is America supposed to fix anything? So he's asking for loans and to different departments, and it's just not working, and people are starting to demand change. He's not neglecting it, but ultimately he's not able to fix it. He can't figure out how to fix it. And so there's this episode of struggle with the bonus army. A large group of unemployed World War I veterans asked for early payment of their bonuses promised to them in 1924, which is basically saying, like, you get bonuses for serving in the army in World War I. And so they went and they were like, we would like our bonuses now, please, thank you. They called themselves the Bonus Army because they were a group of veterans, but the army did not win support from Congress. They turned to the president for help, and he said no. The army then, of more than 20,000 people, some of them with their wives and children, built a little shanty town on the edge of D.C. And moved into the capital. And Hoover became more and more frustrated because he couldn't pay them, so they're embarrassing him. And so on July 28th, government agents informed the bonus army that they must move out, and they refused. So police were sent to force them out, reinforced by men from the main camp. So these veterans, though, they get reinforced, and they meet the officers with bricks. So they're literally throwing bricks at each other. And into this, the policemen are starting to fire, which means that 2 are killed and 2 more are wounded. And Hoover learns of this and sends General Douglas MacArthur and says, fix this. And so he says, get them out. And MacArthur says, okay. And so after 1 hour's warning, he marches in with tear gas, tanks, and bayonet. Once the outside buildings were clear, he then moved on. And although the actions were much harsher than he had originally wanted, Hoover said, yes, I did this. And this made him look like a jerk, saying, yes, I said fire on our veterans. And so a desire for change in leadership is saying, some people are talking about socialism and communism. They're saying, like, look, Russia's not dealing with this. Look, Italy's not dealing with this. Now, they were, but they weren't telling anybody about it. And so they're saying, well, what now? Is communism going to be the answer? And obviously that's not a good idea. But this is all happening right around an election. Okay, so the election of 1932 is Herbert Hoover as the Republican versus a new guy. His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt is related to Teddy Roosevelt. Nephew, I believe. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt cousins. Wants to be president, and originally he's struck with polio in August of 1921, and he's actually paralyzed from the waist down. But his efforts to overcome this disability helped endear him to the public. In 1928, he wins the governorship of New York. He's a Democrat, so this is a big deal because in 1928 everybody was about the Republicans. So Roosevelt enters the Democratic Convention in 1932 as the frontrunner. He meets some stiff oppositions, including conservatives and Tammany Hall, remember the political machine, but he manages to appease the conservatives with his vice presidential pick, John Nance Garner of Texas, who's very conservative. He won on the 4th ballot, so it took him 4 different votes to figure out a majority, and when finding out, he flew from New York to Chicago to make his acceptance speech in person. This unprecedented but calculated action helped portray him as a daring man who's willing to change tradition. And that perceived defiance of tradition was actually going to be the central issue of most of the campaign. Hoover says, listen, we need to go for American tradition. This is what has made us great in the past. Keep to what's been working. And Roosevelt says, no, we're going to do new things. And his campaign song was Happy Days Are Here Again. Now, they weren't happy and they weren't here again, but that was his campaign song, and people wanted to take that risk on something new. So Republicans, some Republicans who were caught in the crossfire, they weren't in a singing mood. But Roosevelt was in an enviable position because Americans wanted something different, and so Roosevelt was a pretty easy winner. And he avoided explaining details of his economic plan because he didn't want to turn anybody against him. He just said, I'll be different, I'll do something new, and it worked. He pledged a New Deal in his acceptance speech, and that New Deal is now permanently what we refer to as all of his programs. We call it the New Deal. And people are willing to look to a man who overcame a serious handicap and say that you will help us overcome difficulties. Roosevelt won more than 57% and swept the Electoral College. And so during the months between the November election and the March 4th inauguration, the poor defeated president still has 4 months of trying to figure out what the heck to do. And nobody's helping him now. And a brief upturn in the economy made Hoover say, look, I fixed it. But unfortunately, it couldn't be fixed. He tries to get Roosevelt's help to deal with some of the bank stuff, but Roosevelt refuses to help him because he doesn't want any of the stuff that they blamed Hoover for them to also blame him for, right? So if he helps Hoover with something, it doesn't work, then they can say, well, you helped him and now it's your fault. And he doesn't want to do that. So it's a good move politically, but it's a bad move because 4 months of intervention, particularly with the banking crisis, could have changed some things. And so Roosevelt's not helping either, but nobody's blaming him yet because he's not president. So this is where I leave you for today, right as Roosevelt becomes president. Tomorrow we will talk about the New Deal and what the Great Depression was doing to American society. But you do have a pretty simple Juno pod for today, so complete that. Good luck, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye, guys.